Anyone even remotely interested in checking the credits of some of music's biggest records over the last 40 years will have heard the name Steve Lillywhite. From leading the formative U2 to stardom, to working with the Rolling Stones, Peter Gabriel, the Pogues, the Lars and the Killers to name just a few, Steve's career spans different generations, collecting 6 Grammys along the way, bringing to the table his enthusiasm, commitment and knowledge of how to make hit records. This is the story of his career and the key techniques he uses to set him apart from the rest. Having left school with no real academic aplomb, but a keen interest in playing music, a young Steve Lillywhite took a chance asking Phonogram Studios if they had any jobs available. And as luck would have it, they did, as one of their assistants was leaving the following week and Steve was able to join immediately as his replacement. The job mainly involved being a tape operator and being a junior member of the studio, of course making the tea. He quickly fell in love with studio life and committed himself to being the best at what he did. Whether that was anticipating where punch-ins might be needed when tracking, so having the tape ready without delay, to practicing his engineering skills at the weekend with up-and-coming bands. One of these bands was a pre-mid-year Ultravox, and on the strength of Steve's demos, signed a record deal, after which the band insisted that Steve also work on their debut record as engineer, earning him his first proper credit. His next big break came when he convinced Johnny Thunders that he could make a better sounding record than his band The Heartbreakers' previous work. Steve recalls totally bluffing at this point, as he was still pretty green around the studio, but his bravado and hard work paid off, with the sound of the record impressing the Siouxsie and the Banshees manager, who was looking for someone to improve the sound of their first single. Realising it was more about the band's opinion of the overall sound rather than some abstract notion of fidelity, Steve seized the opportunity to help them make the record they wanted to hear, which was in contrast to the first attempt they had at the record. The result was Hong Kong Garden, which was a hit for the band and a massive leg up in the business for Steve, enabling him to work with bands like XTC on drums and wires, and Peter Gabriel on Peter Gabriel 3, or Melt as it became known. This album is famous for being the birth of the gated drum sound, but as I mentioned in a previous video about Hugh Padgham, who was the engineer of the album, Steve maintains that this sound had been worked on before when he made the Siouxsie and the Banshees album. The story goes that it came about out of necessity. As the drummer wasn't that proficient, he decided to record the drums in 2 stages, separating the cymbal work from the rest of the drums, and this allowed an unexpected effect on the sonic possibilities. To make the drum sound fatter and bigger, you can increase the overtones with heavy compression, as it brings up the quieter sustain parts. But doing this to cymbals can create a cacophony, or wash effect at best, which is not often particularly desirable. That sustain is also increased if the drums are recorded in a lively room, which they were for Peter Gabriel's album, as they captured Phil Collins playing in the Townhouse Stone Room. This sound would later evolve into its logical conclusion on the Phil Collins hit In the Air Tonight, produced by Hugh Padgham. Having hits meant that Steve could now pick and choose who he worked with, and he did his best to associate himself with some of the best artists around, including Joan Armatrading and the Psychedelic Furs. There was also a call from some future greats that caught his attention. One of these bands was a fresh-faced 4-piece from Ireland named U2. At 18 years of age, they were awkward and raw, and perhaps not the most technically gifted, but anyone who saw them live agreed that they had something. Steve recalls meeting the band for the first time, and was struck by how shy and introverted they came across. The band, on the other hand, later remarked that they thought Steve was like a children's TV presenter, with his enthusiasm and affable nature. Importantly though, they did hit it off in the studio when recording U2's first album, Boy. That being said, a trait that would distinguish a U2 session from a lot of other bands was that it was fairly chaotic, with songs being worked out in the studio and lyrics written at the last minute, which is in stark contrast to how he worked previously with bands like XTC, where everything was meticulously planned. The studio being used for the recording was more designed for Irish folk music than rock, so he had to improvise when it came to the drum room, placing them in the larger reception area for better acoustics, complete with the receptionist's telephone ringing in the middle of recording. The album was a success for the band, and featured the hit single I Will Follow. This song has Steve playing the bicycle spokes while Bono smashes glass bottles. A good example of creative thinking while coming up with an atmosphere behind the music itself. They teamed up again for their next album, October, but it nearly never happened, as Steve actually recommended they venture out to try another producer in order to expand their experiences. Although they did actually ignore this advice and went on to record this and their next album, War, with Steve at the helm, and songs like Sunday Bloody Sunday and New Year's Day really kick-started their career and path to superstardom. Around this time, there seemed to be quite a Celtic rock theme with Simple Minds and Big Country fronting this trend, and Steve worked with both of these bands. When asked how he got those big guitar sounds that feature prominently, Steve replied that it was simply a task of faithfully recording the sound the guitarist had developed himself and giving it enough space in the mix. In the case of U2 and The Edge, It was fairly easy with only 3 instrumentalists, of course. This advice can apply to a lot of situations, not just guitars. To make things sound big and impressive, you have to be disciplined not to overdub too many elements. If you want to focus on a particular instrument, the best way is to strip back everything else. A key to his consistent success at this point was picking and choosing the best talents to work with, but also influencing some element of development in the artist's sound. Steve is a big fan of the Beatles, and in particular the way they continually evolve, never sounding stale. He was now in big demand in the mid-80s, and even the Rolling Stones came knocking for him to produce their album Dirty Work. The album is not a standout record in the Stones' canon, but it did afford him a first-hand look at how they worked at that time, with Keith and Ronnie recording all-night blues jams, and Keith doing his best to avoid Mick, and vice versa. One of the biggest records Steve worked on is nearly everyone's favourite Christmas hit, Fairytale of New York. The genesis of the writing and recording was quite an involved process. The song was always going to be a duet, but it was originally written for Pogues bassist Kate O'Riordan to sing. Unfortunately, she left the band with their producer Elvis Costello, so the song was put on hold for a while. When Steve entered the frame, he suggested his wife Kirsty McCall, and the band were open to her trying it. He recorded Kirsty at his home studio, bringing in the tapes the band to hear later.
You promised me Broadway was waiting for me. You were handsome. When the band finished playing, they howled out for more.
They loved it, and the song was now back on track, and they had the key ingredients for its future success. It's well documented that the Pogues lead singer Shane MacGowan liked to drink a few, and he wasn't necessarily alone with that indulgence in the world of rock and roll. Asked how he managed these temperamental artists, he said it was a case of acting quickly when they were most lucid. If that meant early in the morning, then so be it. Even if you were tired, it was a case of getting the most work done when they were most on it. The artistic temperament is always something to be considered, and perhaps one of the most brilliant but challenging was the last songwriter and frontman Lee Mavers. Their debut and only album was a long process of Lee's seemingly endless search for a magic that he could never find. It was rumoured that he even harvested 60s dust from amplifiers and sprinkled them on mixing desks they were using, although probably not quite accurate, certainly portrays an image of what he was trying to attain. He was even distrustful of Steve's involvement, having been associated with popular bands like U2 and Simple Minds. Steve recalled, "We'd record 6 songs that were fantastic, but if there was one thing wrong on the 7th, he would be convinced everything else was terrible and we'd have to start everything again." In the end, the record label ran out of patience and the album was released. Lee Mavers was upset with Steve, as he said the lead vocals used on the record were only meant as a guide.
They weren't like the proper performances. They were just like, we were messing around in the studio, fiddling around with sounds and not happy, playing tongue-in-cheek. And that's the state that all the recording was up to by the time we left. We jibbed it at about 3 months into it, because it was still no better since day one. And somehow, they've even got voices where there wasn't voices and mixed that up as well. So, but still, I am embarrassed about it, singing. It's terrible, what I mean? It's a croak. It's non-musical, and, I think the record's non-rhythmical or anything. It's a mess,
For me, the Lars album is fantastic. I loved it at the time, and I still do. Steve continued to work with U2, mixing songs from The Joshua Tree, Acton Baby, All That You Can Leave Behind, How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb, and No Line on the Horizon. It's obvious that strong trust was developed between them, and that Steve played a big part in their evolving sound. He has remained very active since the 80s and 90s heyday, working with Travis, The Killers, and BDI, just to mention a few. He currently lives in Indonesia, working with local artists such as the band Noah. It seems very fitting that someone always keen to evolve and experiment is living and working on the other side of the world, gaining new experiences and enjoying the opportunities it brings.